Alright, good evening everyone. Welcome to our disc guidance section for MenatBot. This is Kanzuki Dynasty here with Rillian, and we are restreaming as usual from my personal channel to our 2MK main channel. And so, today we have MenatBots, who came together quite quickly, actually, and yet is sufficiently terrifying. So to begin, we can go through some of the recordings and look at what each one does in sequence before we go and put them together to see the full impact. Menat's main trick, of course, being the release of her orb and pulling it back at interesting times, along with various other manipulations of it. The first action gives her the ability to do that, as well as an anti-air and, apparently, on rare occasions, her CA. On its own, this isn't necessarily...
The main thing about this is to note that the bot actually uses a different setup for its meter than most, and it is actually important. You'll note that whenever we restart it, the battle, or shift things around, that the trigger gauge starts off at maximum but does not refill. You'll notice this later on. And her CA gauge also starts off at maximum but does not automatically refill.
Is that a CA cancel out of the orb? Because that's even more terrifying. Yes, it is. So yes, those are the main obvious functions of this one. And I don't think that this is an edge shift action, but I may be wrong.
This action has a minor edge shift in it that does not need to be done for people who are just getting used to it or having trouble inputting bots and just want to get a taste of MenatBot in general. It is supposed to hold a medium punch at the end of the input. This is not a relatively difficult edge shift. It has a purpose, but the purpose is leading into another input that is even more difficult to do than that, so you might not want to prioritize it very much. This is also not an input that at first you need to try to get perfect or anything. It's fairly lenient. Once you get used to the idea, the bot will function approximately the same whether or not it is very well done. You'll want to upgrade it later on to get the full effect of it. The main thing it does here is cancel into an orb release. And if you're aware of Menat's general functionality, every time she releases an orb, any button, including using multiple buttons such as an EX input, will in fact cause her to recall the orb, and she's not really able to use any EX move while that's going on. Therefore, putting out the orb at all causes all of her down to forward and punch motions to become orb retrievals. This action is also edge shifted on the final part of it with a down to forward motion as mentioned. It can be a little bit hard to input, especially if you're trying to pull through that and hold medium punch. However, fortunately the rest of the input itself is not too hard. It's just a basic sort of chain cancel combo that most people can easily do. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. If you are feeling as if it's going to be hard to stress getting it through, you should probably focus on only the end, and the rest of it will come fairly easily to anyone who plays nearly any character who does motion styles or regular specials.
Which is almost everyone.
So as you notice, it is also there so she can use her basic buttons in neutral, and that covers more or less the entire purpose. You will notice in our version that the medium punch is slightly imperfect in that one of them is actually slightly before the input. It's just leniency. We decided to leave it in to show off the fact that you don't really have to get these things that perfect to get them to work. They're quite good at either way. And that basically covers action 1, a crouching heavy punch into a Hadouken motion with medium punch, forward medium punch, or neutral medium punch depending, and then another down to forward motion with the ending coming right at the end of that. So, given that, let's move on to action 2.
Alright. Alright, here we have her down V skill. This is Reflector, which can absorb any individual hit and will claim and return fireballs. Although I have not seen it work against Sukuma's air fireball. I don't know what direction that would go. However, other than that, we have quite simply what appears to be just a EX Dragon Punch here. If she has meter, and a heavy one if she does not, to catch your aerial attacks, which this bot does a surprisingly good job of.
At the moment, we don't have a specific reason for why it is the particular heavy punch version that it is. It could be changed. It is unlikely to be changed for various reasons involving how most people are able to input this command. This can be fairly hard to input if you are not really good at your timing, because it does involve a little trickiness in terms of going to the back direction for a little while to make it perfect and so on. So if you find yourself having a lot of trouble with this, one of the good parts is that it can be used differently if you want to get used to it. If you don't have a character that jumps a lot or has a lot of aerial moves, you can simply use a input with the same 2 buttons, which is often likely to come out, and she will still do the EX upward orb, which is a decent anti-air, but still functions as orb recalls. The problem with this is that it will in fact make the bot harder for you to actually get points on, and we'll discuss that when we get to the points system later. The main thing to understand is simply that she does this as an action that is not likely to be seen too often. It is actually not going to be part of the point system, and for the most part she doesn't spend a lot of time doing it. We therefore gave her the heaviest one so that if you decided to get used to punishing her for doing it, she travels as far as possible, forcing you to at least pay attention to your spacing and decide whether or not you want to learn to do more than one punish based on how far she is.
Yes. And Menat's DP here does not counter hit, but it's also not remotely the same as most other DPs in terms of its invincibility properties, from the simple fact that it can't hit anyone standing.
You should also note that with specific inputs of this, if you can do a certain type of reverse blink, it will also give her one more option in neutral. This will be on the bot page, but will not be explained here. It's relatively involved and long to clarify. But the main reason for this is when she doesn't have her orb, she cannot do this move at all. And it has a tendency to turn into the orb recall, but the version we have put in here is very close to perfect and does not in fact do that, which turns out to be relevant in combination with other actions. So the overall action that you're inputting here is really simple. It is just an instant, it's supposed to be instant, an instant down V skill, which is important because of the way it combines with another input, but does not affect it too much. If you can hit the down and the V skill on the first frame together, then this is optimal. But for most characters who generally block low or are defensive or don't need to deal with Menat by literally walking forward, it is not necessary to get this perfect.
And as you'll see, it's not perfect in this one as well.
Because as noted, The characters that are going to be used for demo, while they are footsie characters, don't spend a lot of time getting in on Menat solely by walking, and therefore she doesn't need the emergent crouching medium kick. I have tested this on my version. It's decent, but it's not specifically that much better than just having her doing the raw V skill. And since she will end up therefore doing less of the, we will call it soul throw, she will end up doing less of the soul throw. It's usually okay. So that is the main setup for this one. It is one of the hardest inputs to put in, even though it's very simple in terms of motions. Down V skill, slightly, sometimes press back, not absolutely necessary, and then do a Shoryuken motion with heavy punch and medium punch. So with that said, let's move on to recording action 3.
Alright. This one is nice and simple. It has her jump in it, it has her overhead in it, as well as what appears to be a standing V skill and a throw, which actually may come out more often as a throw tech given the timings involved.
This input is the key necessary input for MenatBot. Fortunately, it is also one of the easiest to put in once you've got it down in terms of timing. Because Menat's V trigger requires you to hold and release buttons to let her orbs go, you do have to do this a little bit differently than most. You may have to hold down the buttons a little bit longer than you're used to. If you are used to just tapping the buttons for the minimum amount of time, you may have to train yourself to do a little bit longer on holding in order to get things to work correctly. The key to MenatBot using her V trigger and actually creating mix-ups out of it is that you have to make sure to hit all of her buttons within her inputs one way or another. We left her with a minimal chance of hitting light punch, which means she will tend to hold on to one orb for a little bit longer than the others. This is also to help you get used to seeing when she has the orbs and the problems it will cause you, and as well as letting you understand when you're stuck, in the sense of she has an orb left, she wants to use it, you can't go near her because she might use it. All of this will become clearer when you go on, but the key to realize when you're inputting the bot is that you may need to hold the buttons a little longer than you normally hold them to do anything. There's also a difference between the way Menat will release orbs based on whether she is standing or crouching, and this is also part of why the bot does different inputs but with different spacing. In other words, the first version of this with the V skill is a down V skill. This does not necessarily release the orbs too differently because we are not sure exactly how the medium ones work yet, but that was because the bot turned out so good that we didn't really have a lot of time to go into the specifics of why it works, but we're definitely sure that it does. Similarly, there will be a back and throw action so that she does the light punch, light kick release while standing, and a crouching throw action so that she does them while crouching, and you'll be able to see the difference in orb releases based on those things.
And of course, anytime she's in the air, we can get the flying ones as well.
So
she
the
should have
recording
everything
here is simply forward medium kick so that she does her overhead. While she is doing that, a back V skill, a back throw are both hidden, and then from there a full forward motion starting from back, up, back in this case sometimes, but you must end on up forward, and this is the hard part of this input. Without the up forward at the ending, this is a very difficult to use input for the bot. She becomes much more predictable, she becomes much more static, and you don't get as many mix-ups as you probably need to learn. On the other hand, this is another edge shifted input, so we suggest that if you are going to try to put it in, especially after just watching this video, you spend a little time doing moves in such a way with Ryu or someone where you end the move at up forward and yet have the down to forward style move come out. If you're familiar with our Chun-Li bot, and to some extent Urien, but more so Chun-Li because Urien uses this much less, you will probably be used to the idea that even though you're pressing the up direction, if you press something else really quickly after it, the up doesn't really register and the special move comes out, and this is necessary for many things. But again, this will be shown off as we go deeper into the bot's functionality, so we'll move on now to action 4.
Alright, and here we have a crouching throw into EX Sphere. We get her EX Sphere, we get slides here. There is another down throw which gives us the crouching orb release for the V-trigger that was mentioned before, as well as providing another throw tech opportunity, since that will be relevant to the bot's scoring system later on.
What can easily be seen from the playback here is that that light punch that you are seeing, the first one, is actually part of the beginning of the bot's action, so she technically has something close to a tick throw, but she doesn't have the great throw range, and she doesn't have the greatest walk speed, so it doesn't turn into too much of one. When this is recorded, this is mostly just her poking you and walking forward, but the key point is that after walking forward, you have to do the forward to down motion on your controller and hold down specifically, so that she is doing the crouching version of throw. We want this to be a forward throw, so you need to make sure not to go to down back, but we definitely need her to be holding down while throwing in order to achieve what was mentioned before. The rest of the input is mostly about making sure that she has a way to throw the EX orb, and we specifically chose to make it EX medium orb so that you have to deal with the medium orb position more often than not. However, when she has no meter, and this is partly why she is not constantly regenerating it, this will then turn into heavy orb, sending the orb upwards instead, so you can't really get used to the idea that she will do one or the other without also learning to watch her meter relatively well. After that, it's just a matter of pushing in her down forward medium kick, which is her slide. It will be important because of her high-low mix-up game, but you don't have to do this too strictly. There's a little bit of leniency in it, and the bot won't be affected too much if you get it wrong, quote unquote. If you realize that yours is too easy to deal with, you probably hit the button at the wrong timing or too many times, but this is not too hard to correct if you get used to it, since it's just doing it after her throw actually works, and it is not hidden, so basically as soon as you see her land and even remotely start the animation for this, you can end the recording there. There is no edge shifting and nothing too specific that needs to be done. If you hold the medium kick, slightly different things will happen, but nothing worth actually trying to do this for. So with that said, let's go on to the final recording, action 5.
Crouch light kick, we have our V trigger here, and then it looks like we have another jump there, it looks like, or a quarter forward movement so that she can do another one of the releases. Unfortunately, without the other actions, she's not going to show us actually releasing the rest of the balls.
The quarter forward motion in here is actually sort of just muscle memory for those who are used to doing this sort of thing this way. The thing you're trying to do is somewhat the tiger knee style motion that some people use for doing various moves at higher levels in various fighting games. However, if you are familiar with either Chun-Li's instant head stomp or her most attempts at her air legs, again instantly, You can actually manage this without too much trouble. You're basically just trying to go from down to up forward and back to down very quickly. The idea, however, is that she should get into the air, and the amount of time you spend moving back to down and making sure you're probably holding down at the end of the recording. This is not absolutely necessary, but it does help a little bit. That amount of time is probably enough for her to barely get into the air, and this action will, as you can see in itself, manage to give her the drill. Depending on how quick you are with it, she will manage to do the drill higher or lower. This also is affected somewhat by whether or not she was in the midst of a particular cancel, or whether or not she riffed a sweep, since this will turn into sweep when she is already in the trigger or has no leader, and various things like that. To change the precise timing of the jump into drill, as you see her now, she's probably doing it sort of like the sweep, but it changes according to whether or not you block it, whether or not you try to punish it, those sorts of things matter. The interaction between these and others, however, is obviously, as always, the strength of the bot. So, the first thing we're going to look at in terms of combinations to show off the bot's primary capabilities is to turn on action. First of all, we're starting with action 5 on at almost all times because it's the quickest way to demonstrate her main way of fighting. But we're also going to turn on action 3 first of all to display what happens when she has enough buttons pressed at some time or another to actually launch all of the orbs.
Alright, and already she has launched all but the lower ones. And there we go. Now she has to either earn back the V-trigger from me hitting her a bunch, or I can reset it. However, since this is going quickly enough, she has it again already.
The other thing that this particular one is supposed to be able to let her do is do a jumping medium kick, which does nothing. This is both to throw you off and because it works as a pseudo anti-air in many situations where her other moves would not, while still moving her around enough that you have to pay attention to the fact that she can simply be in the air. And you should probably still keep your wits about you when it comes to her being able to jump, even if not all of her jump-ins are so great. We were planning to eventually leave her jumping heavy kick, but this is an easy thing to learn to deal with separately, and does not require as much focus. So, given the limited amount of space in the bot we have for doing everything, it is unlikely that this will make it into the final build. Because, first of all, the heavy kick version of this does not ever launch any other orb, and we don't want to then have to work out how to get that done without even more hidden inputs. But more importantly, as you can see, she doesn't really lose out that much for jumping like that. So now we will go into turning on action 1 as well, so that you can see a bit more of how the interactions work without adding too much complexity to the bot.
Oh, darn it. Alright, anyway, as you can see, she's starting to look a lot more like a MenatBot. She is moving around plenty. She will be harassing me with her orb throws and retrieves. we've not quite gotten to the point system yet, but you could start to use this for a just starting point for how to approach her, since she doesn't have necessarily all of her power, obviously, but she is starting to show some of the complexities that are involved. She's hard to get in on somewhat, both by constantly jumping around and moving around, and by the fact that she can pull that ball back at any time, and either make us need to block, or fake it out with her V-skill. Of course, when she has her V-trigger, she remains dangerous. Although she's a little easy to air-to-air or anti-air still at this stage. But that clears itself up a little bit.
The main thing you can see here is that she's able to send out different heights of ball depending on both her meter and just the flow of the match at any given time. She also uses the drill at more times than you'd expect. This is presumably because she only has 3 actions on, but you'll notice that the timing she uses them at do differ enough that you have to think about it, and you have to recognize where she is going to be.
The only piece of advice for fighting this particular tier of the bot is block. Don't get hit by that CA. Anyway.
CA is not actually a very serious part of the bot, because as mentioned, she generally will use up her meter before she gets to do it. It's something you more so have to worry about at the beginning of the round. And to help you with your meter watching, because sometimes just because of the way you're interacting with her, how much damage you're doing in your punishes, or just some other interaction that prevents her from using her meter, then she will suddenly have it, and there's a decent chance she will use it because the EX soul throw, as mentioned, is not even capable of coming out when the orb is away from her, and neither is her EX orb. So as long as her orb is away from her, you should note that she can only fill the meter. There's no way for her to use it. And that also ties back into one of the actual point systems of the bot. The better you're doing, the more likely it is that she's going to suddenly hit you with the and finish you off without you recognizing that that was going to happen.
Yes.
Which is fairly similar to how most people who pick up Menat at first are likely to play her. They'll learn a lot of the very powerful full resource combos. So you have to be careful about watching for their meters. So we included this into the bot just as a little exercise to keep you on your toes, so that you will not be too surprised when it happens, or at least if you are, you will learn the scenarios in which certain things can happen.
Yes. And getting used to that will probably help you out in the future. So this becomes somewhat of a meter watching bot as well, in terms of having to be aware of a lot of different states, both in terms of when she's going to activate her V-trigger, what orbs she still has out from her V-trigger, as well as trying to consider whether her own base orb is away from her or not, and her meter status. All of these things affect her actions and patterns, as well as what's safe and what isn't for you at the same time.
So from here we're going to turn on Action 4. I'm going to allow Action 4 to be on along with all the others because it doesn't interact with that many of them. When we want to demonstrate a certain action later, we may need to turn off some of the others to show it off more clearly. But Action 4 at this point basically just adds the ability to throw the EX orb as noted. And also, because of the edge shift mentioned, it also allows her to throw out the light orb, which causes the orb to go low, but because of the rhythm of the bot, it tends to be less likely that she will throw out the low orb. This is probably also going to match up with most people. So she has a higher chance of throwing out the medium orb, a decent chance of throwing out the high orb, depending on her meter mostly, and a approximately equal but slightly lower chance of throwing out the low orb.
Of course, leaving her in a terrifying state to try and get in on, with the orb out behind you and 2 V-trigger orbs still waiting or more. Yet, given the point system, which we'll go over as soon as we've gotten through a few more of these actions, getting in on her is kind of the goal, so you end up having a very great deal to think about in terms of figuring out when you want to approach, how you want to do things for various actions.
One thing that is important to know that if you don't recognize it, the bot will teach you very fast, is that the orb recall does not specifically home into where Menat was at the time she recalled it. It homes in on a spot on her arm. Now, the bot, by happy accident, has a specific set of actions that makes this harder for you to deal with. Once Menat calls back the orb, if she happens to jump, the orb will drift upward, and if she happens to slide, the orb will drift downward. Now, this normally makes very little difference. However, one of the heaviest mix-ups she has is to throw out the high orb, which normally will pass over your head, especially if you're crouching, and then recall the orb and slide. She has this specific ability from Action 4. If she throws out the orb and then slides, the orb comes down further than it normally would, and you can be hit by it even though it normally doesn't hit you. So you have to get used to the idea that she can do this, and whether or not you need to avoid it, especially on taller characters who already have enough worries about where they can stand relative to her. This generally doesn't affect you if you're blocking or using a basic approach, but if you are walking forward, it can cause the orb to clip your head at timings when you had otherwise learned it would not do that. And it's by this interaction, actually, that I will request that Kansuki Dynasty turns off Action 5 and turns on Action 1, and then we'll operate with just
Action 1
those.
has been on for a while, actually. We didn't turn that off again. So we have
well,
1, 3, 4 at the moment.
Then yes, please turn on 1, 2, 3, 4, leave 5 off.
Okay. The bot is ready. And manages to CA me. Ooh, missed that time. I was too far away.
This Action 5 does not in any way contribute to that aspect of her where she is pulling back the ball, sorry. It is more likely that you will notice her throwing out the heavy ball and then sliding. Honestly, only Action 4 is required to cause that to happen. So rather than just show you that, however, I have asked her to turn on all of these so that you can see that it actually doesn't happen that often, but basically as long as Action 4 is on at all, there you are facing that possibility at some point, especially if her meter is used. However, as noted again, the bot spends a lot more time throwing out the medium ball, and there are no plans to change this at this time, even though the player totally could change it if they really wanted to. At least two of these inputs are not too complicated in what they're aimed for, but it should be noted that the EX orb throws are like the Buki's kunai or similar, where they depend somewhat on the combination of buttons that you pressed in order to do them, and therefore you shouldn't mess with those ones as much. The ones in Action 1 are much more able to be changed without changing the flow of the bot. You can't guarantee that the freedom you get if you make any changes will be a useful one, and may require even more thinking through it. However, since we're pretty sure that most chances to deal with the orb are going to be based around the medium orb, the bot is tailored to this as well. So with that, we will turn back on the last recording and MenatBot will reach her full power, and then Kansuki Dynasty will go into the primary details of the point system.
Alright then. Here we are in all her terrifying glory, complete with opening CAs. The base point system for MenatBot has, as I recall, 3 primary components. One of these is to, when her orb is out and she isn't able to do her EX stuff or other special moves, you want to try and throw her. This can get very complicated very fast because of her recall capabilities. And the fact that she doesn't need to worry about hit center blocks done in the same sort of way with her recalls, because her orb's induced hit center blocks done has nothing to do with her own stops or limitations. So she can poke you and then have the orb go through you, she can do it the other way around, and all sorts of dangerous things. And she causes quite a bit of trouble in terms of the space in front of her either way. Even though she can't use her EX moves, she is still able to use a lot of normals, and even some of them, as I understand it, speed up or get a little bit stronger in neutral when her orb is away and they aren't engaged with it. The other interesting detail here is that she has a lot of throw techs. Although she does not necessarily throw herself a great deal, well, she does a meaningful amount, but not constantly. She has a great deal of techs that are generally hidden, but if you throw her, they will still come out as throw techs. And so you have to navigate both of these factors, managing to get in on her and throw her at an appropriate time, without managing to lose too much life to unexpected pokes, while still having to get around techs to get your points, and it can become very troublesome very quickly. Although there is one saving grace in that once she has started her orb recall, if you manage to get her in a throw while it's on its way back, it will pass through you, because hitting Menat deactivates the hitbox on her return orb. The next point system component is punishing her slide with a combo, or such. And then the other one that I recall is to punish her dive kicks? Yes. In a similar manner.
Note that both the bot's rhythm and the difficulty only really make sense if you require yourself to do both of these things without actually just throwing her.
Yes.
Now, for some characters this may not in fact be the best idea, but it is also true that Menat is a character who can very easily get herself out of throws if she is even very slightly safe. Whereas, normally if you are trying to hit her you will get something good, she has a jumping light kick, which is not part of this bot, but is possible, that can discourage you from throwing her if you mistime your throw. And therefore, rather than try to get the jumping light kick itself into the bot, even though she has a very specific rhythm in which you see it, but I have not actually seen this in a really long time. She's much more likely to drill, and I think we might have taken it out entirely altogether, actually.
Which component?
But the idea, the jumping light kick she once had, but I'm pretty sure we took that out entirely. It depends on whether or not her drill has a... Depends on whether or not her drill has a minimum height. Either way, the quickest thing that you can die to against this bot in that way is underestimating the amount of ways she can keep you from getting close to her while the orb is out, and therefore trying to push in on her too reactively without thinking about it long enough to realize whether or not it's a good idea. Overall, otherwise, the bot is meant to train you to split your focus in a lot of directions. In the direction of which position the orb is in, so that you'll know whether or not you have a good or a bad chance of getting into throw or hit her, as well as working out whether or not it is a good idea for you to try to get into the air yourself to get away from her pressure, and where her meter is and how much trouble you have to deal with based on her having EX needing to do one of her two EX things, or more importantly, randomly throw her CA, and obviously V-trigger itself.
Yes,
she has not been given a lot of defensive ones though.
Her orb returns can also come at some unusual and troubling times, such that even if you are trying to punish her, if you lose awareness of that right away at any time, even trying to punish a normal she throws out or something that you know is unsafe, you could very well get nailed by the orb on its way back, just as she's in a much safer than she would otherwise have been, simply because she has external defense. So there's a... It's very easy to lose track of any one individual component, and when you do, you're going to start taking a lot more damage than you're going to want to if you try to get to 10 points for a bot.
Due to her randomization, it was difficult to specifically give her very good orb mix-ups, but on the other hand, we recognize that overall, as people get better and better, even people in bronze who have had a lot of time to lab her up and learn specific things, the highest chance is that if you do get hit by her V-trigger, most likely either all the orbs are going to get used and you will take a ton of damage, or it won't really matter that much. So we didn't put a lot of effort into making sure that orb setups were a thing we needed to deal with, especially since, despite most other problems, since throws tend to be invincible to everything, it's much easier to deal with her if you can get close enough by just throwing, because then the orbs from her V-trigger will end up actually going through you before she can do anything, and you'll just evade them altogether. So while she does actually have decently long orb combos and mix-ups and similar things, it tends to be a rarer sort of magical thing that happens when the bot happens to do a particular sequence of things. Similar to Urian, where we can get the Urian bot to do entire Aegis mix-ups, but he's not going to do them that often. The concept being that really the bot doing more damage to you randomly is just part of the game. If it's constantly doing the maximum amount of damage to you, then you might be learning how fast you can be killed, but most of us know that, and if we were really that concerned about that at the time, we would probably be fighting someone who actually does those things. The outcome of your matches should generally not be decided by whether or not you took a ton of damage or did not take a ton of damage. The bot becomes harder if it does more damage, but you don't necessarily learn more if that happens.
It really just becomes a matter of, well, now I can get to 3 points instead of 10 before I get obliterated. which does not necessarily help you train anything specific. It just means that you get to win and enjoy your successes a little bit less. Which is not necessarily the best of things, simply from a rewards and learning perspective.
So, while Kanzaki Dynasty tries to show just more general interactions, I'll go into some of the basic things that the bot is able to do as emergent properties that are important to understand as a player about Menat, and things that are relatively important to the bot's design and you should watch out for if she seems to completely lack these things. Because it might be that you're not getting the full impact of the bot and therefore missing out on some of the training, possibly because of some issue with the inputs, the way they were done, or the difficulty of certain leniencies. The first thing to note is obviously that characters who throw fireballs at her, if you're familiar with our bots, you generally know that most of them don't actually, like, it doesn't matter if you throw fireballs at them or not. You don't get any points, but it doesn't really help you get anywhere. So most people just don't do it, but it doesn't really matter if you do or not. There's not a bot that says, hey, practice your fireball game. They tend to either block or just randomly get hit by them, but the point system doesn't give you anything for that. For Guile, you can somewhat play a fireball game with him, but we made him specifically such that he will throw out EX Sonic Boom more often and discourage you. But with Menat, it is actually finally the opposite. This is a bot against whom your fireball game can matter. Your fireball game can matter even though none of the things that are in the point system are related to you hitting her with fireballs, because they change the rhythm she has and keep her away from her orb, keep her from doing certain things. And you can use this to get more points or to keep yourself safe from her orb because of the way its hitboxes work and so on, depending on the button you're using. The other thing she definitely has, which is very important, is her high-low mix-up game, which isn't really strongly a mix-up. She doesn't do her overhead often enough for most people to need to worry about the part of that mix-up game where they must block high. She also does not jump in a way that leads to her hitting buttons mostly, where blocking low is a bad thing. The problem is that we also gave you the specific aim of moving to or from her at any given time, and that is what makes her strong both in the bot's form and against any other person. You have to get closer to Menat, and then that means that Menat has the ability to attack your legs. If you immediately go into crouch block, this will save you, but a lot of us don't have that habit at the lower levels of play. She is meant to help you build that habit where you recognize that your opponent is not necessarily going to be doing a lot of overheads or jumps or whatever, and you take the time to make sure that when you feel vulnerable, you go to crouch block instead of just standing block. This is especially true for characters who do moves that tend not to end in crouching, or who just need to play a lot of footsies and move themselves into very specific situations and positions in order to be effective. One other thing you will see from her a lot is the disorienting feeling that you need to deal with her block in a particular way. Most of us at lower levels have a specific way that we see things coming. When we see an attack coming from a certain spot, when we see it tend to hit a certain spot on our character, we tend to stand block or crouch block, even though the move may not have those properties. Many people that we've encountered have the tendency to try to always block Nash's moonsault standing, for example, even though this is not actually necessary, and it can cause you problems if you don't recognize that you don't need to do it. This is basically the same with Menat. It's supposed to train you to perceive her actions without specifically thinking to yourself, I need to make sure to block this way. And you can use this to learn when to high block and when to low block and what buttons you can get off of what. Finally, she has the automatic ability to pull you closer during an orb pull back. Because when you block the orb, even though you do block the orb while holding back as normal, the hit stun and the push back from the orb, I say push back in that way because the orb does not push you back. If it hits you from the opposite side, it pulls you toward her. This can be used to set up things because we are again used to the idea that if we see that sort of thing happening, that we seem to be moving forward when we don't intend to be moving forward. Many of us reflexively hit straight back on the stick and again set ourselves up for her high-low mix-up game. In terms of her abilities with her V-trigger, the key that we were looking for was to keep you on your toes about the number of different approaches that the orbs can take to get to you, but more importantly to recognize that you have to keep still at least a certain amount. You have to respect her V-trigger enough to be sure of one thing or another because she does tend to manage at least decent combos even here, simply because you never know exactly which orb is going to come out, but more importantly, if you get clipped by either a normal or her other orb, it's very likely that you're going to get hit by more than one of those orbs, especially if you don't get knocked down. So we made sure that there was not a very heavy focus on her potential knockdowns, so that you could get used to being pressured mentally in the sense of her pulling you close and then throwing you, pulling you close and then hitting you with another orb on the way in. Lots of little things on wake up. Just having to get used to that. She's not a very durable character and most of her point systems are based around punishing her. Therefore, she rebuilds her to bar V-trigger extremely quickly. In fact, most characters can cause Menat to rebuild her V-trigger in just about 2 throws and maybe 1 combo. And since you have to throw her to do this, and you spend a lot of time throwing her that might not actually get you the points you're trying to get because she still has the orb at the time, her V-trigger rebuilds very fast, but because she only has 1 action that activates it, and it tends to not happen easily raw, you end up facing her down and thinking, when is she going to activate this? And what is the best position I can be in to try to get other points? Or should I just keep quiet and do little or nothing until she activates it? This is a character-dependent sort of thing to decide. And you should definitely make sure that you make your decisions based on your style as well as your character, to say whether or not you want to make her try to activate it, or go in and see if you can get something off her while she is activating it, possibly a throw or so on. One more thing to note is mostly a visual thing. When you throw Menat, if she does happen to have the orbs out, they disappear. You temporarily lose track of which orbs are out. You have to watch her because the orbs reappear around her rather than specifically drifting toward her. But if you are not paying a heavy amount of attention to which orbs she has left and which orbs have not been thrown, yet you are throwing her a lot, it is easy to lose track of the orbs because they vanish entirely and you have to then reorient yourself, especially if you use a back throw or something. The final point is that this bot is one of the few bots that, well, I should say this character, it's one of the few characters that I'm wondering what they're going to do about her interaction with stages. And in order to demonstrate that, I'll have Council to Dynasty switch both her character and the stage she is on. This bot effectively has 1 additional quote-unquote difficulty level based on the stage you fight her in, depending on how you see the game. So she will switch to fighting her with Cammy on the Lair of the Four Kings stage, and it might give at least a slight idea of what I'm referring to. The color of Menat's orbs is not visually UI style designed to change relative to the background of the stage. And as a result, there are some stages on which some people are sure to argue that Menat has more of an advantage than she naturally should.
Yes, I've heard,
because
for
of-
instance, if you consider the Kanzuki Beach stage, which is already banned in tournaments, she can probably hide her lower two orbs completely under the water for her V-trigger. So, they're already hard
But
enough
on
to
the stage-
see here if you're watching things.
On the stage, you will realize that since Menat's actual orb is transparent, and because this stage has both a lot of things moving around in the background, and heavy variations in color as well as being similar to both Menat's color and the color of her orbs, then on top of that you're adding lighting effects and the colors that go with the low orb. While it is not going to be an issue for everyone, some people's visual spacing, their way of identifying things that are happening on screen means that the character technically is slightly stronger in this stage, because it's not so much tracking down where her orb is, it is tracking whether or not she has it near her in the first place. So you can actually increase the difficulty of this bot somewhat by where you fight her. If you fight her in the grid, for example, all the time, she is much less threatening than if you're fighting her in this stage, because you will see much more of what is going on, but it's easy to confuse one orb for another as is. It's bad enough when you can see her entire character cleanly. The lighting effects and her actual flow make it much harder to deal with that in here. We don't expect this stage to be banned, and we don't expect anyone to make any serious complaints, or at least complaints that are taken very seriously, that you should not play her on this stage. But it may become a thing. However, professional tournaments having a ban on it is not going to change this online, similarly to how you have to put up with Birdie and whoever else fighting you in Kanzuki Beach and hiding the can, banana, and so on. There are definitely going to be at least a few Menat players who will try to get the maximum advantage if they're aware of it by playing her on the stage just so it's confusing. So you should probably consider it. We haven't done anything to the bot to make it more likely or less, but between her default costume, the lighting, and the specifics of this stage's colors, you can get a little bit mentally or visually overwhelmed more accurately.
Yes, I'm generally relatively good at just spatial tracking, but it can be... I noticed a little bit of extra strain from it here. And it makes it just that much harder to track when she's put her orb out and things, so that I know when to go for the throw, when it's simply more or less looks like a part of the stage, especially when you consider that many stage parts just look exactly like it.
In fact, I would say that is probably the thing that makes the most difference. It's definitely not the ability to track the orb once she puts it out. But if it gets off screen and you're trying to look at her character model and figure out from there whether or not she still has it, it takes a couple more frames to register does she or does she not have the orb, and depending on your character's playstyle, that may become a problem. You can also note that her upper orb, while against the specific background, her upper trigger orb against the specific background of the Earth, can vanish for a bit, and then you'd have to, for example, look down at her V-trigger meter and see it was still active to recognize, oh, she still has at least one. Fortunately, that particular orb is not very easy to use defensively and won't come up too often to matter if you're trying to pressure her and she cancels any of them to get out of stuff. But you can definitely see that if you don't keep track of the V-trigger meter, it can be harder. The final point being that the low deployment of her regular orb is just enough to become hard to track. It's not innately hard to track, especially if you were paying attention, but if you were looking at something else on the screen or watching your own character get pushed to a particular spot, recognizing that she has thrown out the low orb on this stage can be a little bit distracting. So we suggest spending some time fighting her here. This is a free stage for those who are not familiar with it, and you shouldn't have any problems just using it whenever you need to.
And the good part is that this being a free stage and causing you at least some degree of the trouble is you will be able to develop a little bit of the skill even without purchasing the Kanzuki Beach and such stages. So you're not going to be as helpless online as you might have been against a Menat meeting her there for the first time without any such practice.
Unfortunately, the reverse side of that is that since it is a free stage, people are much more able to pick it without spending any fight money.
This is true. But that's just a part of the game we're going to have to get used to, I would suspect. After all, they don't necessarily shy away as much as you could guess from that sort of challenge, given that we have Kanzuki Beach, we have Rashid's stage, which is giving some people balance problems, I suppose, and all sorts of related things. So I don't necessarily expect to see them doing anything to make Menat's projectiles more visible here, especially since I can't necessarily think of what they would do that wouldn't just be a meaningful change to their system or aesthetics.
So, for now, I'm going to actually request a segment that we don't normally do in bot basics, which is contrast, because Menat is an extremely complicated bot. We didn't do this for Karine, but we probably didn't need to for her specifically. We're going into the territory of bots, where we have to explain to you why we haven't made the bot before now, such as Mika, Claw, eventually Nash. But it also turned out that Menat is similar to that, and therefore I'm going to use this chance to make this a part of the Disc Guidance segment and clarify some things. So, once Kanzuki Dynasty has fallen against this bot,
just now even,
more, I'll ask her to instead change it to CPU level 7, but change nothing else about the situation at all. Not changing the point system, not changing the focus, not changing the meters, nothing. The purpose of this is to explain to people why it is that even though the character blatantly has things that could be either more powerful or overall more dangerous, why it is that we didn't actually give the bot those things for you to deal with and learn to overcome. Usually the reason is because those are the tendencies that you will find on the CPU version. We usually try against the CPU for a while, see what the CPU has a tendency to do, and what is easy to counter or hard to counter from the CPU. See what could be done better by the CPU to put you under more pressure, because even at level 8, the computer is not that good with most things. It tends to do a particular thing over and over, but is less predictable. And it also, part of the reason why most people don't train against the CPU is because the CPU basically reads your inputs. It is a known fact that you can't do certain things against it unless it's letting you. And at level 8, it's usually not letting you. Also, the way it uses its meter is different. and you're not going to learn a lot of how to deal with the mix-ups. So if you watch this, the CPU will keep itself very safe, it will do drills at particular spacings, and you can use the spacings of the CPU to learn where it will slide that is safe, how it can get advantage against you, and so on. But humans are not likely to space themselves this perfectly. It is in fact slightly bad for you to think to yourself, I can't punish this move because I fought the level 8 CPU and I basically just get beaten all the time. Even if you are familiar with frame data, you could still feel as if it's not really worth your time, you can't get much off it. So the key here is we did not intend to give the CPU something, to give the bot something that the CPU already handles, especially since you can always use your own character and see what the CPU version does to specifically beat that character, because it does somewhat change its methodologies based on the character you're playing at the time. However, if you do go about it as trying to make sure that you do the same sort of things that the bot requires of you, and in this case, Kansuki Dynasty will therefore focus primarily on throwing her once her orb is out, as mentioned. It may become easier to see that you can't necessarily say this is a bad strategy in itself. So once the strategy is more or less clear, we will spend a lot more time trying to teach you how to execute it while you are forced to face the CPU. It becomes much more difficult because the CPU will almost always tech the throw, almost always get out of the way, happen to pull back the orb at that perfect time. There are things that humans, even high-level humans, are most likely not going to be doing, and these bots are not for high-level play anyway. So there are many characters where they won't teach you the sort of things that a human is likely to use as much, but they may teach you some things that are more so discouraging, and you will end up giving up a lot of options you could use against real players for quite a long time, and gaining nothing at all.
Yes,
so if you see anything that the bot does not do properly, in your opinion, switch to CPU mode and see if the CPU will help you train that thing.
Yes, the CPU is definitely very strong versus me. Although I don't have as much bot experience with Cammy either. She's doing a lot more to counter things. She's doing timings a little bit tighter and more perfect in various ways. And so it becomes somewhat difficult.
On the other hand, you will often find that the CPU has usually some glaring weakness because of just how AI works for particular characters that you can exploit to generally beat them terribly. And if you're the sort of person that can't easily keep up with the level 8 CPU, but are still quite capable of keeping up with people, usually the lower levels of the CPU have intentional holes in their game that may not convert well or map well to the actual likely weaknesses of players. The artificial weaknesses that the CPU is given haven't historically been that close to those of people. In that sense, in the terms of Kansuki Dynasty's ability to gain particular things, You'll also note that while the CPU is on, and we're not sure when this changes because I don't remember it always being this way, when the CPU is your opponent, you do not actually get to see their inputs, presumably because it would make it too obvious when it was cheating.
I'm not necessarily sure it bothers generating inputs in the first place, it just has it execute the moves. But yes,
I'll do that. And so we basically make sure that the bots can do this while still putting up a fight so that you become used to what button it is, what scenario it is that this has happened, so that you can learn to recognize things mentally, just in case you need a little extra push to let you know what button that was. Usually you can only do that in a match. And since the CPU can't be asked or counted on to eventually repeat something, it can slow down your ability to learn how to fight a character based on their buttons or similar.
Right. You get no replays with the CPU.
So with that, for the final 15 to 20 minutes of stream, I will be mostly handing it over to Kansuki Dynasty, and she can go back to fighting the bot version and give you just her general expectations and overall experiences. As noted, she didn't play Cammy against MenatBot very much. It was mostly a Korean thing. So now she can get used to how Cammy approaches this.
Indeed. So you can see my initial observations from her as well. With Cammy, I'm immediately noticing that it's a lot more difficult for me to get in on her while she is... Well, she does have the projectile out. And I'm getting the other punishes more easily instead. Which was a little bit the opposite on Karine. I could get the throws much more easily than I could necessarily immediately start getting, for instance, the dive kick punishes. Which is partly walk speed, partly not having Seppo. And the dash being, I think, a little bit shorter, or perhaps I'm just using it less accustomed to it. So the first obvious choice I make here, after probably losing this round, since I have 1 HP left, there we go. Is that, I have been, for Karine at least, often trying to dash in as soon as she puts out her projectile. Which is easier in that case than this one, I think, for whatever reason. And it's possibly the stage as well, which I might switch out in a little bit. The other unfortunate thing is that while you do need to get in on the spot, she does not let you sit near her for very long, because while her overhead is not the most frequent thing in the world, she is going to do it enough that it will cause you trouble. Or simply throw you. Her throw range is not bad at all. And combine that with the fact that if you try to throw her but she's decided to slide or has decided to drill, you don't get any points for that because you're not supposed to punish those with throw at all. It can be a little difficult to get in and outright handle things. Something a little bit unusual to MenatBot that is not something you'll experience with most other characters as much is that because if you're trying to punish something like this slide, for instance, because her orb recall can be cancelled out of literally anything, you're often enough going to have to react very quickly to cancels to try and keep yourself safe that you didn't necessarily expect. Alright. One of the things you're going to end up spending a bit of time with when you're learning to fight this bot and get the points and such is, as really noted earlier, it can be getting in and then actually hitting her with the throw can be a bit tricky because she will do some random things at certain times after she's put out the orb, leading you to possibly need to consider either slightly more patience or learning where the right windows are to finish your approaches. Of course, it helps if you can kick her away from the orb once it's out, just to slow down its return time. Since if you pull her across, it can be on the other side of the screen and even off the screen, giving you a bit more time to deal with it. So this may become part of my strategy versus her with Cammy. We're going to have to see as this progresses, or as I train later on. On the other hand, in the sort of position you saw there, throwing her outright immediately can be one of the best forms of defense you have against random V-trigger activations. Which there's a lot to react to in this bot from all sorts of directions, more so I think than any other character is capable of. And all of that gets into the bot. You're getting plenty of examples here as well with this stage of me losing track of when the orb is actually away from her, and I should be doing things. one other thing to consider for at least the more impatient people like me when you're starting to approach this bot is that there will be times when she puts out her orb where it is just better to not even attempt to do anything to her. Just even let the opportunity go away, wait for the next one, simply because it will be too dangerous, or you feel like she's going to do something, or based on her reactions or what she's up to, immediately after she puts it out, you just realize that I'm not going to make it in right now. And that's going to be important to at least some characters when fighting this bot, or obviously when fighting a real person. But she will definitely not let you get away easy if you don't pay any attention to it. Of course, this is somewhat obvious when her V-trigger is out in many cases, but it can happen in any situation otherwise. Just because your spacing is a little bit off for your approach type, because she does something, or you need to watch and wait a little bit to see if what she does after it, and certain times will have different patterns.
One of the final notes I have is that because of the way her normals change when she does or does not have the orb, we aim to get as many of those particular normals into the bot as possible, which is why you don't really see the right kick. Which is why you don't really see the crouching medium punch, even though that is technically almost as good as the standing one. A lot of this is based on recognizing that when she doesn't have the orb, it is easier to do certain things just based on her normals. But when she does have it, you'll have to deal with things like her sweep and cross-ups that don't otherwise seem to be helpful. So you don't see a lot of medium kick from her. That's mainly the reason. There are some situations in which we will suggest specific things for characters, and she's probably one of the bots that's most likely to have variants later on that are meant to specifically help with matchups for other specific characters against her. Whereas now, this is basically just helping you deal with the concept of Menat, the concept of Menat's pressure, if you can call it that, and the awareness required to take advantage of her with your own character without taking a ton of damage. Anytime you can just land combos on her, you're already winning. The concern is when you get confused, or when neutral gets weird, or those sort of things. But we'll definitely be trying at some point, especially based on any suggestions anyone has, about how to change her very slightly, or potentially even more so than that, so that she's harder to fight for grapplers and more likely to teach them the sort of skills they would need to defeat her, or more difficult to beat for characters like Fang or Nash, who have an entirely different way of dealing with this matchup than most would, but still have to deal with her mix-ups.
I'm going to find myself burning a lot of meter just trying to get repositioned relative to her for a Cammy. However, though, I don't seem to have any other particular notes coming to mind, and I don't believe Brillian does either. So, I hope you all get a good run with MenatBot when we release her this weekend, probably Sunday evening. And then manage to do a bit better fighting her online in the shower of people trying out Menat that always comes a few weeks after the new character. So, have a good evening everyone, and see you on Monday for our future streams and other such things. You can pick up MenatBot at our website, 2-mk.org/bots, Sunday evening, for your own use, or obviously try to do something based on this data in this stream already. Have a good evening, everyone.